St James's Palace, the hidden jewel in the monarchy's crown.
It's one of the most iconic buildings in central London.
Built by Henry VIII, this historic Tudor landmark is vital to the royal family today.
The nerve centre of the monarchy throughout Elizabeth's reign was St James's Palace.
And within its grand state apartments in the throne room, King Charles was heralded.
St James's Palace is absolutely central to the proclamation of a new monarch.
Yet many of us know surprisingly little of what goes on here. St James's is the oldest palace in the capital, 200 years older than Buckingham Palace, and it occupies around 3 acres of prime London real estate just down the road. It's also the headquarters for some of the most famous royal traditions.
It's the seat of the British monarchy.
Its fortress walls are the keepers of royal secrets.
St James's Palace is often, almost like a forgotten palace.
A notorious king was imprisoned within it.
Charles is brought back to St James's Palace
Before he's to have his head cut off.
A young queen became a global trendsetter here.
Victoria's choice to get married at St James's Palace in white changed everything. She was the first ever bridezilla.
Its private chapel was where one of our most famous royals lay in rest.
After Diana's death, her coffin lay in the Chapel Royal in St James's Palace.
And where royal firsts have taken place.
It was an extraordinary story, the Queen becoming a landlady for the first time.
Unheard of, how could this be?
Safely behind palace doors, teenage William met his future stepmother for the first time.
Camilla emerged from this room with William and said the immortal words, "I need a gin and tonic."
But will the palace that's the heart and soul of royal tradition retain its pole position under a modernising future king?
The prospect of William liking all the pomp and pageantry and all of those things, I think he will hate that.
In 2015, the royal family appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace for the annual pageant of Trooping of the Colour for the Queen's official birthday. But behind the scenes, the Windsors were dealing with money issues. Issues that St James's Palace would help to solve. The royals had been criticised because they'd been £2 million in the red.
The Public Accounts Committee that keeps an eye on public finances and royal finances to make sure that the public gets good value for money, published a scathing report.
I said, basically, you're spending far too much money. You've got to do something about it. There's more going out than's coming in.
I've been covering royal finances for 15 years. You can sort of see the tension there between the government and the royal palaces.
So the Windsors embarked on a bold money-raising venture that would be a royal first and involve the oldest palace in town.
The royal family came up with a brilliant idea of renting out some of this extremely exclusive property for extortionate prices.
And they zeroed in on St James's Palace.
Ideally located, as they say, off Pall Mall, in one of the most expensive parts of London, St James's had the potential to attract well-heeled high earners.
They had the idea of letting out apartments at St James's Palace. It's a huge palace. There's lots of apartments there that could be let out.
It was an extraordinary story, the Queen becoming a landlady for the first time.
Unheard of, how could this be?
I think she'd been stung by criticism of the royal finances not balancing, so to speak, and the royal family spending more than they earned.
And to their credit, powers that be there decided that they would do something about it.
Buried in the royal household's annual accounts in 2015, it was revealed that 2 grand apartments within St James's Palace were quietly made available to rent on the open market.
I was looking how much the royal family had spent, and I noticed this line in the document saying that 2 apartments at St James's Palace were up for rental.
We call them apartments. I mean, they're huge, 4 or 5 bedrooms.
The extraordinary thing was the fact that members of the public could rub shoulders and literally live cheek by jowl with members of the royal family.
You had Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie sharing an apartment there, the Princess Royal, Princess Anne. So it really was home to some members of the inner circle.
One of the apartments put up for rent was number 29A, which is located on this corner of St James's Palace. It's a two-storey home complete with 4 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms.
There's a sweeping staircase, amazing fireplaces, and generally it's very grand.
And to attract top rent from the most elite tenants, the apartment was given a luxury makeover.
There was £500,000 was spent renovating this apartment, which they thought would be perfect for lettings.
There was new plumbing, new bathrooms, new kitchens, new carpets, really being made to appeal to the high end of the market.
The groundbreaking scheme would appear to have paid off for the royal family.
It was put on the market for a rental of £20,000 a month, or about £250,000 a year.
So quite the return on investment over several years.
There aren't that many people that could afford it, so it was very appealing to sort of super rich types, maybe international types.
But who's actually moved in has been kept hush-hush.
The names and the identities of the people living in St James's Palace have been kept secret. The royal family have not literally been announcing who they've rented these properties out to.
It would have needed to have been vetted, because being in such close proximity to members of the royal family requires you to tick a lot of boxes in terms of security.
Despite the secrecy, last year it leaked out that a pair of A-list celebrities had rented one of the apartments.
We did learn last year, actually, that Hollywood royalty got the chance to live in St James's Palace.
I'm a social diarist, and there's always interest about who's living where, particularly with big sort of superstars who are staying in London. We had rumours that Catherine Zeta-Jones and Michael Douglas, Oscar winners, had moved into St James's Palace, and it was the case.
Clearly, they passed the security questions there.
Catherine Zeta-Jones has been very public about being a fan of the royal family.
Catherine Zeta-Jones has talked about how she and her family dress up for royal occasions. Her son puts on a black tie.
She also had lunch once with the now Queen Camilla and got on very well with her.
Rather handily, their move to St James's made them neighbours of the King and Queen around the corner at Clarence House.
What better way can you say that we've made it than to have St James's Palace as your London pad?
But also to get that security, to know that you've got almost the same security as the royal family is a big attraction for someone like Catherine Zeta-Jones and Michael Douglas.
I think this is an excellent blueprint for the future, actually, because the royal family is bursting with property. It's not a good image, it's not a good look, and I think they're aware of that. And I think if this can work at St James's Palace, this could happen elsewhere.
Who knows? We might have Tom Cruise living next to Prince William and Catherine at Kensington Palace. The mind boggles.
So where exactly is the Desres Palace of St James's, and what secrets are hidden behind its walls?
It's one of the most iconic and important buildings in central London.
St James's Palace is fantastic. It's so historic, 500 years old.
Despite being steeped in centuries of history, St James's Palace isn't a moated or gated fortress. It sits on around 3 acres between the prime locations of Green Park and Piccadilly, and is just across the Mall from Buckingham Palace. The palace is built around 4 courtyards, and since 1603, every monarch has been proclaimed from Friary Court, which is just off Pall Mall. St James's has been the monarchy's HQ for 300 years. On the south side of the palace, the state apartments are where the royals meet ambassadors and do their VIP entertaining.
It's the place where Charles III will receive foreign dignitaries, banquets, or charitable events are held in these apartments.
At the front of the palace, just beyond the huge gatehouse doors, is the Tudor Chapel Royal, used by the Windsors for important family milestones.
Today, we know it mostly for christenings. Prince George was baptised there. Prince Louis, most recently, was baptised there.
Many of St James's buildings, though, contain offices for some of the most famous royal ceremonies.
The investitures for people to collect their MBEs, their OBEs, may be a knighthood. It's all organised from St James's Palace.
But St James's Palace is also where a royal traitor was forced to await his destiny.
It is a very distressing sight. People who see it at St James's say it's an incredibly emotional thing.
St James's royal roots go back to 16th century England, when it was built to protect a longed-for son and heir.
Henry VIII built St James's Palace in the 1530s, his great era of palace building.
And it was built in the middle of a field. It started life as a leper hospital, which needed isolation. That had long gone by the late 15th century, when it had become a smart mansion, and in the early 16th century, Henry VIII took it over as a royal house.
St James's Palace at the time was a very isolated area.
It's difficult to think about London as full of lush, dense forests where deer roamed. When he was visiting, Henry went hunting.
Henry's new retreat was an eye-catching sight in the rural landscape.
St James's in about 1540, all of it was built from Tudor red brick. A sprawling palace of 4 courtyards, but it was stuck in splendid isolation.
Henry had big plans for his grand retreat half a mile from his home at the Palace of Whitehall.
Henry was in love with Anne Boleyn. He thought she was marvellous.
St James's Palace was to be all about the relationship with Henry and Anne Boleyn, that very ill-fated relationship.
But what the king wanted more than anything was a male successor to continue the Tudor line.
Henry was convinced Anne Boleyn would give him a son, and he married her in 1533. And the idea was that this son, his longed-for heir, would live in St James's Palace.
In those days, in Tudor times, the heir to the throne was housed separately from the monarch, partly in case there was disease or plague and for security.
When Anne Boleyn announced her pregnancy in 1533, the scene was set at St James's for Henry's plan to come to fruition.
The son and heir never did materialize, though Anne did give birth to a baby girl, the future Queen Elizabeth I. Henry fell out of love with her rather dramatically, and she was accused of treachery and plotting and having affairs and beheaded.
Her time living at St James's Palace is rather a short period, and it's a tragic story.
In 1625, a Scottish cousin of the Tudors, Charles I, became King of England and Scotland, the start of what would be one of the most turbulent reigns in British history. And tragedy was about to strike once again at St James's.
One of the country's most unpopular kings. He is hated, he's reviled.
Charles had lived at St James's since he'd been a boy. His father, James I, had extended the palace massively after the death of Elizabeth I.
He did a lot of building work on it, new stables, new courtyards, new state apartments, including a most wonderful and magnificent royal art gallery.
Now king and married to his teenage bride Henrietta Maria, Charles I also spent lavishly, making St James's their private family home where they would have 5 of their 7 children.
London has grown, London has soared. St James's Palace is now much more of a central palace.
Charles is very committed, as is Henrietta Maria, to making St James's Palace a palace fit for him as king.
Charles loved St James's Palace. He filled it with the most incredible artworks. He spent money on the interiors. It was his haven.
But Charles had put himself on a path to conflict with Parliament, for which he'd pay the ultimate price.
Charles I really wants St James's Palace and his other palaces to be great showcases of grandeur and to show, the monarchy is all about me. He believes in the divine right of kings. He really wants to amass power to himself.
Charles's high-handed and high-spending ways were proving to be controversial.
The country is now in a bit of a bad way. The country is suffering, and Charles is spending all this money on the palaces when the country's coffers are empty.
By the 1640s, Charles and Parliament are completely at loggerheads. He insists that it's my way or the highway.
But Parliament wouldn't fall in line with Charles.
Ultimately, we have a civil war that engulfs the country brutally, that splits and divides families and villages, with some people supporting the king and some people supporting the parliamentarians.
The outbreak of war sees Charles's beloved family home, St James's Palace, commandeered by Parliament for its soldiers.
During the Civil War, Charles actually has to leave London. This is, as it were, the low point for St James's Palace. It's no longer a centre for royal power.
The two sides waged a bloody war for 7 years before Charles was defeated.
Charles is captured. Then he is told he's going to be put on trial for treason. And that is astonishing, because the whole crime of treason is against the king.
A real bewildering time where people were not looking for the abolition of the monarchy or anything like it. But of course, events start to get ahead of themselves.
Charles I was charged with treason against the country. For the first time, a monarch in England was put on trial.
It is the foregone conclusion. He's found guilty. He's sentenced to death.
Charles is brought back to St James's Palace, which had been for many years his family home, and now it's to be the place where he's to spend his final days.
And you might think, well, that's a kindness, because he loves St James's Palace. But when you go to St James's Palace, it's nothing like it was. It's fallen into disrepair. He's praying, he's desperate.
The night before that execution, before he's to have his head cut off, he's allowed to see 2 of his younger children, his daughter Elizabeth, 14, and his son Henry, 9.
They are brought to him. They are in floods of tears. They're just hysterical.
It is a very distressing sight. People who see it at St James's say it's an incredibly emotional thing to have seen.
The next morning, on the 30th of January 1649, Charles left St James's Palace to meet his executioner at Banqueting House in Whitehall.
On that fateful morning known as the regicide, the execution of the king, the poignancy that Charles must have felt as he is led across St James's Park from the palace where he'd known such high times to the banqueting house. He goes out onto the balcony and he lays his head on the scaffold.
The block being so low on the ground, he needed to essentially lie completely down as the ultimate sense of submission.
His head was taken off with one swipe of a sword.
There was apparently a great groan, almost a very painful sound that came from the crowd, and a sense of shock that this had happened at all, a shock that it had come to this.
Charles's remains, though, were treated very differently to others executed for treachery.
Normally, the head of a traitor is put on a pike, but that doesn't happen. It was actually sewn back onto the body, and then the body was put in a lead coffin and embalmed, and then the body was put to be viewed in St James's Palace.
Charles I's body lay at St James's Palace for almost a week, awaiting its fate.
At St James's Palace, they're not sure what to do with him, and they're almost shocked at the immensity of the thing that they have done, that they have cut off the head of state.
As Charles was finally buried at Windsor Castle, the last of St James's Palace's riches were removed by England's new ruler, Oliver Cromwell.
After Charles's execution, of course, Oliver Cromwell didn't want the trappings of royalty. He got rid of the crown jewels, and he got rid of a lot of the palaces.
The art collection at St James's Palace and the other palaces is dispersed eventually to be sold, but it survives as a building.
When Oliver Cromwell died almost 10 years later, royalists seized their chance. In 1660, Charles's son, Charles II, returned to Britain to restore the monarchy. He also wanted to restore St James's to its golden heyday under his father.
And so St James's Palace, that Charles II, he'd been born there, he'd been brought up there, he loved it. He was determined to make it into a beautiful, beautiful palace.
He develops the grounds of St James's Palace in a very remarkable way. It's huge, expansive landscapes, rather like Versailles. A huge straight canal is created, lined with trees and avenues and great perspectives, one of them along what's now the Mall. St James's Park as a landscape with a watercourse, that really is the creation of Charles II.
St James's Palace was also very convenient when Charles wanted to spend time with his favourite and most famous mistress.
Charles II is an inveterate philanderer, and he has many mistresses.
Nell Gwyn was one of Charles II's mistresses, infamous actress.
Nell Gwyn was gorgeous, she was glamorous, and Charles II fell totally in love with her. He had many, many mistresses, many illegitimate children. His wife turned a blind eye to it all.
His posh mistresses, they're given lovely apartments at the kind of official palace of Whitehall, and he will spend afternoons with them.
But Nell was quite determined and canny woman who knew her own mind.
She was much more working class. She didn't want to be in the same palace as all these high society ladies. She knew they'd be rude to her. So she wanted to be installed by the king as a mistress, but not with that lot.
And so a compromise was struck that she would live in a residence in Pall Mall, adjacent and after St James's Palace, so that Charles could go from there to see her. But she was very clear she wanted to be in her own space, and so Pall Mall became really on Nell Gwyn's terms, the deal.
In many ways, Nell was his favourite, and he would go and carouse with her at that house or in the park adjacent.
Charles kept Nell and the sons they shared together close to him at St James's Palace until his dying day.
Nell has risen from genuinely abject poverty in London's East End. And so to give her a place of her own ensures that when Charles dies, she and their sons will continue to be well provided for. And Charles is very concerned about this. He's very conscious that Nell comes from a different background. In fact, when he's dying, he allegedly says to his brother, who becomes King James II, "Let not poor Nellie starve." James II does make an effort to make sure that Nell stays comfortable in the house that Charles bought for her.
The young, newly crowned Queen Victoria is married at Chapel Royal at St James's in 1840, and we discover just what she did that turned her into a global trendsetter.
Victoria made a very, very crucial choice. It changed everything.
At At the turn of the 18th century, a freak accident was about to make St James's Palace the centre of royal life. It would soon replace the Palace of Whitehall as the principal royal residence. For 150 years, British monarchs had called Whitehall home.
The Palace of Whitehall is a magnificent monstrosity.
And it stretched all the way from Westminster Abbey right up to the Royal Mews at Charing Cross. 24 acres of buildings.
But a mishap with some laundry at the Palace of Whitehall in 1698 catapulted St James's to the top palace in London.
Having survived the Great Fire of London, the Palace of Whitehall cannot quite survive the accidental carelessness of a staff member trying to dry some linen.
Whitehall went up in flames.
Whitehall ceased to exist.
A really key turning point for St James's Palace and its story. It's from that moment it becomes the official place of the monarchy, the official residence.
Queen Anne was the first monarch to live and rule from St James's. But 60 years later, the palace's appeal as a royal residence was already waning.
In 1760, when George III, a young man, became king, he was expected to make his principal residence St James's Palace, but he didn't much like St James's Palace.
He found it a poky old Tudor palace with not enough space, not enough privacy. He really felt that this was unsuitable for the kind of modern king he wants to be.
Newly married with a young wife to think of too, George looked for somewhere else to live.
When he marries the German Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, he buys a new marital home for her, and he buys it from the Duke of Buckingham's son, Buckingham House.
Beautifully organised, symmetrical, classical building, absolutely in line with Georgian taste. This is what George and his Queen Charlotte developed as a residence fit for the age.
St James's may have lost its royal resident, but it retained its status as the seat of the monarchy.
George III, his official place where he held presentations and held audiences for most of his reign was St James's Palace.
So it still had the official role. It is the court of St James. That is the phrase that is used. St James's is the beating heart of the monarchy.
But in 1809, disaster fell on St James's Palace.
A fire broke out. About a quarter of the building was gutted by it. It was a terrible thing. People just saw the charred remains of this palace.
A whole corner on the east side of the palace was lost. The result is one of the most familiar aspects of St James's today.
Eventually, Marlborough Road was driven through the East End in 1856 as a consequence of losing this chunk, this corner of the palace. And so this curious open courtyard that we witness today, almost by accident as we come across it, is indeed the result of an accident.
And work continued on other parts of St James's. In 1821, Clarence House was added to a corner of the palace for the Duke of Clarence.
The southwest corner of St James's, an old service yard with stables, was recast with a brand new house, and it looked $1 million. It didn't cost that much. It cost £22,000, but that was a pretty good investment for a very smart house.
But the addition of Clarence House didn't improve the palace's appeal as a royal home. In 1837, the 18-year-old Princess Victoria came to the throne. She didn't want to live in St James's Palace either.
Victoria was keen to make a new start. Nearby, there's this spanking new place, Buckingham Palace, developed by her uncle, George IV.
Victoria was a young queen. She needed to establish her own reign. And one of the best ways of doing that was felt to be by where she lived. So the grandeur of Buckingham Palace was felt to eclipse that of St James's.
But St James's retains its cachet. It's still the court of St James.
We might say Buckingham Palace is the stately home. It's the wedding cake of monarchy. But St James's Palace is the real meat. That's where the business goes on.
And when Victoria married her beloved Prince Albert, it was the seat of the monarchy that she turned to as a venue.
Her actual wedding to Prince Albert took place in the chapel in St James's Palace.
Victoria said she wanted a more intimate affair that would best reflect her love for Albert as a woman for her husband, rather than as a queen for her consort.
The Chapel Royal at St James's Palace is really the private chapel of the royal family. It's the most intimate, sacred, special family place.
Victoria went for a whole new look for her big day at St James's that has set the standard for brides around the world ever since.
Victoria made a very, very crucial choice. She chose to have a white wedding dress that hadn't at all been the fashion before then. Lots of women would wear blue or brown, any dress would do.
She had chosen the design and the materials of her dress. Silk and satin from Spitalfields, lace from Honiton and Devon, with a nipped-in waist, off-shoulder sleeves with lace all around the bodice. It's remarkably modern.
Once Victoria got married in a white dress, surrounded by bridesmaids dressed in white, it changed everything. It started like a starting gun. All of it, marquees to spending a fortune, to giant buffets, to huge amounts of bridesmaids in puffy dresses, all of it can be blamed on Victoria. Victoria, in her white dress at St James's Palace, was the first ever bridezilla.
The marriage of the future George V to Mary in 1893 was the last royal wedding to be held at the Chapel Royal. But nearly 100 years later, the chapel at St James's returned to royal favour.
Prince Andrew really brought it back into fashion.
Princess Beatrice, who was herself christened there in 1988, and her parents, Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, set a trend for modern royal babies.
The then Duke and Duchess of Cambridge followed suit in July 2013, when they considered the Chapel Royal the right place for a future king to be anointed.
Prince George was christened at 3 months old in 2013 with the Queen and Duke of Edinburgh in attendance, as well as Prince Charles and Camilla as they were at the time, and his 7 godparents and their spouses.
It's that blend of something very familial, very domestic, very special to the royal family, as well as, of course, significant for the history of the royal family and the monarchy.
The Waleses returned to the Chapel Royal for Prince Louis's christening in 2018. As William walked through with Prince George and Princess Charlotte holding their hands, Charlotte looked at the photographers assembled and just told them, "You're not coming in." It showed from an early age that she's quite a feisty character.
Chapel Royal may have provided the setting for many happy family moments for the Windsors, but St James's became the backdrop to a catastrophic family breakdown in 1992.
The marriage of Diana and Charles, it fell apart over a number of years, and it really started to deteriorate in the public consciousness in the early 90s.
It had been coming a long time, we all knew that, but 1992, the annus horribilis was really the culmination of the whole thing.
And one of the most dramatic announcements I ever covered was the announcement in December 1992 that Charles and Diana were to separate.
It is announced from Buckingham Palace that, with regret, the Prince and Princess of Wales have decided to separate.
A huge announcement.
The split meant the Wales's living arrangements would need to change.
You know, they were still living at Kensington Palace. Things became increasingly acrimonious. According to reports, Princess Diana even went so far as to change the locks on their apartments.
St James's became a haven, really, for Charles after the breakdown of his marriage to Diana. Kensington Palace was very much Diana territory by then.
That gave Charles the opportunity to move his office and move into St James's Palace, and it became his London home for many, many years.
The move to St James's gave the then Prince of Wales another opportunity.
When Prince Charles was back at St James's Palace, obviously he had a lot more freedom. He was away from prying eyes of Diana and other people at Kensington Palace, and then he could pursue his relationship with then Camilla Parker Bowles. It became a new life, really. It was a kind of bachelor pad again for him.
It was very convenient for them to meet at St James's Palace. They were often in London. Charles had a lot of work down here. And so it was a safe place for them to meet.
It was more than 3 years before news of the Wales's divorce came through, and the final deal was struck at St James's Palace.
I spoke to Diana about it several times, actually, before the divorce, and she always said, I don't want a divorce. It's not part of my plan. But I guess if that's what had to be, then I'll go along with it. But she didn't want one.
The late Queen obviously didn't want them to divorce. And then the Panorama interview happened, and finally the Queen said, OK, a line has to be drawn under this.
They discussed the terms of their divorce at St James's Palace. It was a place away from the other members of the royal family or the press. And they had a meeting in Charles's apartments in St James's Palace.
The meeting delivered a deal, and when details of the settlement emerged, St James's Palace was part of the package.
Diana did get much of what she wanted to. She received a large lump sum, so she kept her title of Princess of Wales, and she was able to use apartments at St James's Palace for events.
Interestingly, just hours after that meeting, Princess Diana actually released a statement to the press saying that the meeting had taken place and that she would keep her title of Princess Diana. This kind of blindsided some members of the royal family who weren't so sure that the terms had actually been laid out.
That meeting at St James's Palace in February 1996 was crucial in ironing out the divorce deal, which I suppose we can now see helped secure the future of the monarchy. The divorce settlement meant that, to a degree, Charles could move forward.
But a shocking royal tragedy would thrust St James's into the public eye like never before.
St James's Palace became almost a scene of pilgrimage for mourners who descended.
Diana, Princess of Wales, has died in a car crash in Paris.
The day that Diana died will be seared on my memory forever.
I was at the airport when Charles came from Balmoral and boarded the plane that was going to Paris. I'll never forget that, and his face as he got on the plane just hours after he'd heard that Diana had died.
There was some resistance, I believe, from the Queen and the Duke that she should be given, if you like, all the trappings of a full member of the royal family. And eventually, someone up there said, "Ma'am, do you want Diana to be brought back in a Harrods van?"
On that day, August the 31st, 1997, it was decided that Charles would bring Diana's body back to Britain with full royal honours.
When Princess Diana came back from Paris after her death, her coffin lay in the Chapel Royal in St James's Palace. It was there by the altar.
It wasn't a lying in state, but it might just as well have been. I think that's how the public felt about it. But there she lay, privately at the Chapel Royal, and it's to the Chapel Royal that members of the royal family came to pay their respects and sit with her.
In the early days of September, books of condolence were opened at St James's for the public to leave their messages.
St James's Palace became almost a scene of pilgrimage for mourners who descended, forming queues 12 hours long to sign books of condolence there. It really became one of the focal points of that really extraordinary period.
Nobody was really prepared for what was happening. They started off with 4 books of condolence for people to sign. It then went up to 15. Then at the end of the 5 or 6 days when Diana was there, I think it reached 43 books.
And that was the beginning of what I think did become mass hysteria, really, but the incredible sadness that overtook the whole nation.
On the eve of the funeral on the 5th of September, the Queen and Prince Philip returned to London from their annual holiday in Scotland.
The Queen came down from Balmoral, and the first stop she made, the first place she went, was to the Chapel Royal St James to pay her respects to Diana. After she saw Diana, she did come out into the crowds with Prince Philip.
There had been some concern as to what sort of reception she might receive, because obviously emotions were incredibly high. But in fact, she received, smatterings of applause from the crowd.
William and Harry also visited their mother at Chapel Royal on the day before her funeral.
William and Harry were waiting in the vestry, waiting for their moment to be beside their mother's coffin. The Queen Mother's chief page was laying a wreath on Diana's coffin, and he realised that it was several feet lower than it had been, because both were boys that wanted to get close to the coffin, and out of respect, they had lowered it by several feet.
From St James's, the Queen returned to Buckingham Palace to make her live speech to the nation.
First, I want to pay tribute to Diana myself. She was an exceptional and gifted human being.
On the morning of her funeral, the gun carriage bearing Diana's coffin drew up at St James's Palace.
In the most replayed footage of Diana's funeral, St James's Palace is front and centre, because that's the exact moment where William and Harry and Philip and Charles Spencer and Prince Charles, when they join the cortege.
This is really rather symbolically important, because St James's Palace is really the beating heart of the British monarchy. This is a recognition of her place in the heart of the nation, but also of the monarchy. She is the mother of a future king.
The envelope from William and Harry on the front of the gun carriage, which said just mummy, and I think that got the heart of every mother in the land. So from St James's, they made this dreadful walk all the way to Westminster Abbey, and they did it with enormous dignity and pride and sorrow.
With the loss of their mother, William and Harry had to leave their London home at Kensington Palace.
William and Harry were both away at school, but it became clear that they needed to move in with their father. Now, this would have been a huge wrench. You know, they had grown up at Kensington Palace. It's where they lived with their mother, and now suddenly their whole world has been turned upside down.
It was decided that they would move with their father to St James's Palace. Charles's apartment was too small, really, for the three of them, so York House was set aside and refurbished to an extent.
York House is part of a wing on the northwest side of St James's Palace, facing onto Cleveland Row. Built in 1736 to accommodate an heir to the throne, Edward VIII had also lived there before he was king. Queen Elizabeth's cousins, the Duke and Duchess of Kent, had lived at York House for years. They'd moved out a few months before renovations started, turning York House into a modern 5-bedroom home for William and Harry.
It was a place where, while they were at school, they could come back, be in central London, behind the safe walls of St James's Palace with their father there right beside them.
Shortly after he moved into York House in 1998, William first crossed paths with his future stepmother.
A key event in Prince William's life and in Queen Camilla's happened at St James's Palace, because it's where Prince William first was sort of formally introduced to Camilla as his father's girlfriend.
Camilla was by this time spending quite a lot of time at St James's Palace with Charles. But they had fought shy of actually introducing her formally to the boys.
However, one afternoon, Prince William came back to York House and he bumped into Camilla. Now, this was an accidental meet. It was the first time we believed that they'd really laid eyes on each other.
Charles and Camilla realised that it would be odd if they didn't meet. But, Charles asked William, is that okay?
And within a couple of minutes, he had arranged for both William and Camilla to sit down and have a cordial chat. Now, don't underestimate how difficult this was for both of them, okay? It's difficult for William. It was incredibly hard for Camilla to be thrown into this situation with her future husband's eldest child.
The two of them had tea together, William and Camilla. I think they were together for about half an hour. And by all reports, it went pretty well.
And what we do know is Camilla, in the way that she does, she emerged from this room with William and said the immortal words, "I need a gin and tonic."
During the turbulence of the 1990s and throughout Elizabeth II's reign, St James's remained her centre of gravity.
St James's Palace was very important to the late Queen. She loved the Chapel Royal for private worship. I mean, it was a bit difficult, obviously, for her to go to Westminster Abbey, but the Chapel Royal was the private Tudor chapel in St James's Palace, so she loved that. Monarchy is all about symbolism, of course. She understood that better than anybody else. And the history of St James's Palace.
And controlled from within the palace's historic walls is the machinery of monarchy that's so associated with the late Queen's rule.
While Buckingham Palace was kind of the front page of the Elizabethan monarchy, the nerve centre of the monarchy throughout the whole of Elizabeth's reign was St James's Palace.
Because so much of the ceremonial, but also the practical work of royals and the monarchy takes place from offices in St James's Palace.
One of the most famous royal institutions run from St James's is the monarchy's part in the honours system.
The British honours system is perhaps the best known in the world, whether it's knighthood or the ones we know best, OBEs and MBEs.
But the actual honours system is officiated by the government and signed off by the Prime Minister. But then it moves over to the Central Chancery, which is based at St James's Palace.
You have to go along and be invested, which is a wonderful ceremony. It is from St James's that you'll get your notification about where you should turn up, when you should turn up, who is going to be investing you.
Once you've chosen which day you want to go, they won't tell you which member of the royal family will be presenting the honour, because if they did, everybody would choose a day that the king was doing it. And it was the same with the late Queen.
But even in the glittery world of royalty, awards and palaces, matters don't always go quite as planned.
A few people have returned honours, famously the Beatles.
I was a huge Beatles fan back in the 60s, and I have to say I was so pleased. In 1965, the Beatles were made MBEs.
There were vast crowds when they turned up at the palace to get them from the Queen.
But 4 years later, one of the Beatles went public about his change of heart regarding his MBE.
As a protest against violence and war, especially Britain's involvement in Biafra, which most of the British public aren't aware of.
Lennon also wrote a letter to the Queen alongside his returned MBE, explaining all his reasons.
He also was objecting to Britain's support for America and Vietnam, but most particularly because his song, Cold Turkey, was slipping down the charts.
I was going to send the MBE back anyway. I could have done it privately, but the press would have found out anyway. He would have been here a week later instead.
It had actually been with his Aunt Mimi, who obviously he was very close to growing up. Presumably she liked the MBE, but that was collected from Aunt Mimi and returned to Buckingham Palace. But he also gave letters to the Prime Minister Harold Wilson and the Central Chancery at St James's Palace.
It seems the royals quickly put the awkward situation to one side because Lennon's MBE was found lying in a palace vault in 2009.
It was 40 years later that it was discovered, languishing at the Central Chancery. It was still in its box, and the letters he had written. And apparently it's still there because someone has to claim it.
Both Beatles fans and historians have asked for John's MBE to be brought out and put on display somewhere. But actually it's down to his next of kin, which will be his widow, Yoko Ono, to come back and claim it. And that's something that hasn't happened yet.
In 2000, the late Queen agreed to have her portrait painted at St James's by one of the country's most controversial artists.
This was a very brave move by the Queen. There were obviously fears, not only was it brave, but would it be foolish?
But what would this new portrait actually look like? At the turn of the millennium, when the late Queen Elizabeth decided to try something a bit rock and roll, she chose to do it at St James's Palace.
One of perhaps the most curious decisions our late Queen made, in portraiture anyway, was to agree that Lucian Freud should paint a portrait of her. Now, he's not known for being traditional in his work.
This was a very brave move by the Queen because just a few years before, Lucian Freud had painted a very famous picture called The Benefit Supervisor. Now, this was a very controversial, stark painting of a naked woman. So there were obviously fears, not only was it brave, but would it be foolish?
But she did give more than a dozen sittings for Lucian Freud, and they're all at St James's Palace in the Royal Conservation Studios, and she spent hours and hours and hours with Lucian Freud. They were quite similar in age. They spent an awful lot of time discussing horse racing, friends in common.
Queen Elizabeth's sittings for Freud at St James's took place over an 18-month period, and the resulting portrait got a very mixed response.
Well, it's quite a small painting. She doesn't look like beautiful, but I think she looks very, very real. The image is actually a very, very powerful, if controversial image. Not everybody likes it.
It was awful, in my opinion. And the Queen looked, her face rather swollen and curiously blotchy. Some people said she looked like a prop forward. Others said she looked like a corgi.
A good friend of mine, Arthur Edwards, the Sun photographer, suggested that Lucian Freud should be put in the tower for this painting.
There's a lot of insight, actually, and love in that portrait. The fact that she was prepared to be portrayed by a cutting-edge contemporary artist, to spend hours and hours with him in that conservation studio in St James's Palace, that says a lot about her, and the fact that he gets a completely unique portrait says a lot about him.
An altogether easier PR story for the Windsors at St James's Palace was the announcement of a much-anticipated engagement.
Prince William finally popped the question. They did get engaged in 2010.
It was a very long courtship. William and Kate were dating from the university, and there was lots of questions, lots of speculation. She was called Waity Katie because people were questioning how long she would have to wait till William put the ring on her.
They went on to break up, get back together again. Everybody was waiting for this momentous occasion.
Gave people a real lift. I think people have been hoping it might happen.
And the photo call was at St James's Palace, the seat of the monarchy. It was a very appropriate place for it to be.
But footage of that event, I know, is almost unusable because there are so many flashbulbs happening.
Kate and William met the world's press in one of the grand rooms that make up the state apartments.
Catherine coming in a beautiful blue frock, which she looked quite nervous, as she would be. And I mean, it was a phenomenal moment in her life. She showed off her beautiful engagement ring, which was, of course, Diana's engagement ring. That fabulous sapphire and diamond ring. And she still wears that ring almost every day.
It was nice, the future of the monarchy in this ancient setting of St James's Palace.
William and Kate married the following year, but the wedding's multi-million-pound bill drew criticism from some quarters.
Oh, it's going to be a huge waste of taxpayers' money. You know, why not have a slimmed-down ceremony? Why do we need to have a big occasion? But it went ahead at Westminster Abbey, the wedding. It was a huge affair, and I think everyone would judge that it was a great success, and the doubters were silenced.
Shortly after, in 2012, the same scrutiny then fell on William's cousins who were living at St James's Palace.
Princesses Eugenie and Beatrice actually had some of the poshest student digs available because they were given a wonderful 4-bed apartment inside St James's Palace while they were studying. Now, this was all fine, and it was a nice, safe place for them to live.
But it reached a point when they'd graduated, they'd finished their education, and they weren't senior working members of the royal family.
They are HRH, but are they full-time working royals is, you know, the constant debate. Should they be receiving grace and favour apartments?
But the princesses weren't ready to give up their royal residence.
People began to question, why on earth are they living there rent-free? There was anger that this was happening, and it was Prince Andrew, actually, that dipped into his own pocket and paid the £20,000 a year rent.
The debate about royal spending continues for the Windsors. So where does it leave the future of the palace most associated with costly ancient ceremonies?
The Queen died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon.
September the 8th, 2022 brought news of the end of an era in British history. And within hours, the eyes of the world would be on St James's Palace.
The death of Elizabeth II was a much feared, but also much anticipated event.
The longest reigning monarch in our history. There was a national outpouring of grief. But of course, the wheels of monarchy continued to function, as indeed they had to.
It was all planned out down to the last detail, but to see it enacted, and so swiftly, was actually quite shocking, because it was within hours, really, of the Queen's death.
I too now solemnly pledge myself, throughout the remaining time God grants me, to uphold the constitutional principles at the heart of our nation.
St James's was the crowded epicentre for the official ceremony of Charles's accession to the throne, just 48 hours after the Queen's death had been announced.
St James's Palace is centre stage because it is from the chambers of St James's Palace that the accession council that meets to proclaim Charles as Charles III.
Britain hadn't witnessed an accession for 70 years, and this one would be different.
For the first time in 2022, the cameras were allowed into the Accession Council, so we got to see all of this happening, the speeches, the proclamations, the official title of the king.
The whole accession ceremony takes place in the state apartments, which face towards the Mall on the south side of the palace. First, the Accession Council meets in the picture gallery to proclaim the king. The council then moves to the throne room. Here it's joined by the new monarch, his heir, and his consort. In the throne room, the signing of oaths takes place, which seals the deal.
Many people didn't even really know anything about St James's Palace, didn't even know it was there, but all eyes were on it.
It was a clever idea by the royal family to allow cameras to come in that time because it was really a way of Charles stamping his own personal trait on the proclamation when it happened.
The accession itself at St James's was quite businesslike. All the prime ministers and dignitaries were gathered, and it was like a straightforward business meeting, very, very sombre.
Then, in a tradition dating from a time long before newspapers and TV, the public proclamation was made.
The crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is solely and rightfully come to the Prince Charles Philip Arthur George.
That's how news was spread. And the Garter King of Arms went out onto the battlements of St James's Palace to Friary Court.
God save the King!
Trumpets, all of that, and he proclaimed the new king. And that is the official announcement.
The history of St James's Palace and the importance of it to this day was really dramatically represented in those few days.
3 cheers for His Majesty the King! Hip hip! Hip hip! Hip hip!
There's one proclamation that didn't go as planned, though. Edward VIII in 1936.
After his accession council, the proclamation in Friary Court, there he is with Wallis Simpson, the wife of another man.
He writes in his memoirs, what would be the harm if I were to join some friends whom he had invited, including his lover Wallis Simpson, to view these proceedings?
There's Wallis Simpson with him, breaking all the rules in a public space that he's flaunting her.
They were conducting this affair increasingly publicly, and at the time that would have absolutely scandalised the nation.
Edward bringing his married lover to his accession was one source of public outrage. Another problem was that he had been seen watching his own reign being proclaimed, which was taboo.
By law and tradition, kings and queens were never meant to witness their own public proclamation. But as with so much to do with Edward VIII, he decided to break the mold. Photographs of the new king and Wallis peering out from one of the windows of St James's Palace was published and was circulating, and there was comment about how Edward perhaps really was ill-advised to have witnessed his own proclamation.
It seems Edward wasn't expecting to be caught out so publicly, and he took action.
Edward VIII had been sailing quite close to the wind in terms of his relationship with Mrs Simpson. At that point, when he discovered that this footage existed, he ordered that it should never be shown.
The controversial piece of footage was labelled, "On the orders of King Edward, this scene cannot be used."
Which suggests that even he realised quite how awful this would look to the British public.
As Charles III begins his reign, St James's position as the seat of the monarchy remains as it has for centuries. But there is change afoot.
I mean, Charles definitely has an idea of slimming down the monarchy.
There's a real pressure to account for what all these palaces are doing, and indeed the reality of being incredibly wealthy, having incredible numbers of palaces and residences and rooms that are unoccupied, and how that looks.
Could this mean new royal faces at St James's Palace?
Prince Andrew has lost his apartment and his office in Buckingham Palace, so he has nowhere in London. I understand talks have actually taken place to see if Prince Andrew could have somewhere in St James's Palace.
Maybe even Harry could be staying over at St James's.
One of the many conundrums about Prince Harry's future is, will he remain a Councillor of State? The Councillor of State is required to have a UK residence, a UK address, if you like. And he doesn't have one anymore since he was evicted from, or asked to leave, Frogmore Cottage.
There has been discussions that they could give him a room if he ever came back from the United States. And they've also looked at St James's Palace. Now, this would not just resolve the issue of him not having an address in the UK, but he could therefore step in as a Councillor of State if something dramatic happened and it was needed. This brings up an extraordinary situation where if an office or a room is given to Prince Harry, you could have the two royal pariahs both given accommodation in St James's Palace.
But what about the long-term future of St James's? How will the palace that's the heart of royal pomp and pageantry from a bygone era fare under the modernising William?
William's very conscious of the way people want to live in this day and age. He wants to be relevant. He wants to be relatable. We saw William, on his 40th birthday going out and selling the big issue. So, I would predict we'll see less of him wearing velvet robes and feathered caps.
The prospect of William liking all the pomp and pageantry and all of those things, I think he will hate that.
Once he actually gets into St James's Palace, he knows St James's Palace, he's lived there in the past, but once he sees how important it is to the monarchy, I think he will come round.
St James's Palace will continue to be the centre of the British monarchy as long as there is a British monarchy. You need somewhere which is the sort of symbolic nerve centre of the monarchy, and that's St James's Palace, as it's been for hundreds of years.
St James's may be labelled as the most forgotten palace in the monarchy's portfolio, but that's probably how the royal family likes it. Life under the radar allows its beating heart to quietly continue its world-famous work, supporting and driving forward the House of Windsor.
Diana, Princess of Wales, has died in a car crash in Paris.
The day that Diana died will be seared on my memory forever.
I was at the airport when Charles came from Balmoral and boarded the plane that was going to Paris. I'll never forget that, and his face as he got on the plane just hours after he'd heard that Diana had died.
There was some resistance, I believe, from the Queen and the Duke that she should be given, if you like, all the trappings of a full member of the royal family. And eventually, someone up there said, "Ma'am, do you want Diana to be brought back in a Harrods van?"
On that day, August the 31st, 1997, it was decided that Charles would bring Diana's body back to Britain with full royal honours.
When Princess Diana came back from Paris after her death, her coffin lay in the Chapel Royal in St James's Palace. It was there by the altar.
It wasn't a lying in state, but it might just as well have been. I think that's how the public felt about it. But there she lay, privately at the Chapel Royal, and it's to the Chapel Royal that members of the royal family came to pay their respects and sit with her.
In the early days of September, books of condolence were opened at St James's for the public to leave their messages.
St James's Palace became almost a scene of pilgrimage for mourners who descended, forming queues 12 hours long to sign books of condolence there. It really became one of the focal points of that really extraordinary period.
Nobody was really prepared for what was happening. They started off with 4 books of condolence for people to sign. It then went up to 15. Then at the end of the 5 or 6 days when Diana was there, I think it reached 43 books.
And that was the beginning of what I think did become mass hysteria, really, but the incredible sadness that overtook the whole nation.
On the eve of the funeral on the 5th of September, the Queen and Prince Philip returned to London from their annual holiday in Scotland.
The Queen came down from Balmoral, and the first stop she made, the first place she went, was to the Chapel Royal St James to pay her respects to Diana. After she saw Diana, she did come out into the crowds with Prince Philip.
There had been some concern as to what sort of reception she might receive, because obviously emotions were incredibly high. But in fact, she received, smatterings of applause from the crowd.
William and Harry also visited their mother at Chapel Royal on the day before her funeral.
William and Harry were waiting in the vestry, waiting for their moment to be beside their mother's coffin. The Queen Mother's chief page was laying a wreath on Diana's coffin, and he realised that it was several feet lower than it had been, because both were boys that wanted to get close to the coffin, and out of respect, they had lowered it by several feet.
From St James's, the Queen returned to Buckingham Palace to make her live speech to the nation.
First, I want to pay tribute to Diana myself. She was an exceptional and gifted human being.
To Westminster Abbey, and they did it with enormous dignity and pride and sorrow.
With the loss of their mother, William and Harry had to leave their London home at Kensington Palace.
William and Harry were both away at school, but it became clear that they needed to move in with their father. Now, this would have been a huge wrench. They had grown up at Kensington Palace. It's where they lived with their mother, and now suddenly their whole world has been turned upside down.
It was decided that at St James's Palace with Charles. But they had fought shy of actually introducing her formally to the boys.
However, one afternoon, Prince William came back to York House and he bumped into Camilla. Now, this was an accidental meet. It was the first time we believed that they'd really laid eyes on each other.
Charles and Camilla realised that it would be odd if they didn't meet. But, Charles asked William, is that okay?
And within a couple of minutes, he had arranged for both William and Camilla to sit down and have a cordial chat. Now, don't underestimate how difficult this was for both of them, okay? It's difficult for William. It was incredibly hard for Camilla to be thrown into this situation with her future husband's eldest child.
The two of them had tea together, William and Camilla. I think they were together for about half an hour. And by all reports, it went pretty well.
And what we do know is Camilla, in the way that she does, she emerged from this room with William and said the immortal words, "I need a gin and tonic."
During the turbulence of the 1990s and throughout Elizabeth II's reign, St James's remained her centre of gravity.
St James's Palace was very important to the late Queen. She loved the Chapel Royal for private worship. I mean, it was a bit difficult, obviously, for her to go to Westminster Abbey, but the Chapel Royal was the private Tudor chapel in St James's Palace, so she loved that. Monarchy is all about symbolism, of course. She understood that better than anybody else. And the history of St James's Palace.
And controlled from within the palace's historic walls is the machinery of monarchy that's so associated with the late Queen's rule.
While Buckingham Palace was kind of the front page of the Elizabethan monarchy, the nerve centre of the monarchy throughout the whole of Elizabeth's reign was St James's Palace.
Because so much of the ceremonial, but also the practical work of royals and the monarchy takes place from offices in St James's Palace.
One of the most famous royal institutions run from St James's is the monarchy's part in the honours system.
The British honours system is perhaps the best known in the world, whether it's knighthoods or the ones we know best, OBEs and MBEs.
But the actual honours system is officiated by the government and signed off by the Prime Minister. But then it moves over to the Central Chancery, which is based at St James's Palace.
You have to go along and be invested, which is a wonderful ceremony. It is from St James's that you'll get your notification about where you should turn up, when you should turn up, who is going to be investing you.
Once you've chosen which day you want to go, they won't tell you which member of the royal family will be presenting the honour, because if they did, everybody would choose a day that the king was doing it. And it was the same with the late Queen.
But even in the glittery world of royalty, awards and palaces, matters don't always go quite as planned.
A few people have returned honours, famously the Beatles.
I was a huge Beatles fan back in the 60s, and I have to say I was so pleased. In 1965, the Beatles were made MBEs.
There were vast crowds when they turned up at the palace to get them from the Queen.
But 4 years later, one of the Beatles went public about his change of heart regarding his MBE.
As a protest against violence and war, especially Britain's involvement in Biafra, which most of the British public aren't aware of.
Lennon also wrote a letter to the Queen alongside his returned MBE, explaining all his reasons.
He also was objecting to Britain's support for America and Vietnam, but most particularly because his song, Cold Turkey, was slipping down the charts.
I was going to send the MBE back anyway. I could have done it privately, but the press would have found out anyway. He would have been here a week later instead.
It had actually been with his Aunt Mimi, who obviously he was very close to growing up. Presumably she liked the MBE, but that was collected from Aunt Mimi and returned to Buckingham Palace. But he also gave letters to the Prime Minister Harold Wilson and the Central Chancery at St James's Palace.
It seems the royals quickly put the awkward situation to one side because Lennon's MBE was found lying in a palace vault in 2009.
It was 40 years later that it was discovered, languishing at the Central Chancery. It was still in its box, and the letters he had written. And apparently it's still there because someone has to claim it.
Both Beatles fans and historians have asked for John's MBE to be brought out and put on display somewhere. But actually it's down to his next of kin, which will be his widow, Yoko Ono, to come back and claim it. And that's something that hasn't happened yet.
In 2000, the late Queen agreed to have her portrait painted at St James's by one of the country's most controversial artists.
This was a very brave move by the Queen. There were obviously fears, not only was it brave, but would it be foolish?
But what would this new portrait actually look like?